trading pattern that well understood, well managed. The financial crisis raises the question whether we are capable of sustaining a system from a financial point of view. And we still don't have an answer, but in order to grow towards an answer, I think it's essential to try to come to an understanding and an agreement of what are the basic reasons for this to take place. Now, in my presentation, I'm going to put my finger on what I call bank runs. Just a regular bank run. When people go to the bank, and typically banks lend the money, they take deposit, they lend the money, but if all depositors come at the same time, then you have a bank run, there is not enough money in the bank. Now that's a phenomenon that we are very familiar with, and actually it's the reason why we invented the central banks, and which we call lenders of last resort, because when there is no money around, then you can go to the central bank and the central bank can bring money. Well, it turns out that what you see now has many of those characteristics, except that we didn't have a lender of last resort. We don't have a monetary authority for the weather report. We have the Federal Reserve in the US, you have the European Central Bank here, and so on. But we don't have an authority that can print money, let's say, or print liquidity at the global level. So an interpretation of the initial, the reason why a problem which was relatively minor, like the subprime crisis, catapulted into a global crisis, is that as it went that way, as the wave of the crisis expanded, it reached a point where central banks did not have the authority to take care of the problem. So what you saw is that in desperation, the big banks in the north got together and started to coordinate something so that the whole building will not fall apart. And they were relatively successful. When you compare the Russian crisis to what happened with subprime crisis, in the Russian crisis, once the problem arose, it spread across emerging markets, and everybody was hit. This time around, the situation was prevented from collapsing in that sense. I mean, there was a bank run, but very few banks fell apart. And actually the one that everybody knows is the big shock was the Lehman crisis, right? But until Lehman, everything was going, we knew that we had a crisis, but it was relatively mild, and very mild for emerging markets in general, not in Eastern Europe. And I will refer to that in a moment. So we had, the point, there was no central bank for the world as a whole, but in this episode we had several very big banks, central banks, that came forward and helped to sustain the situation at a relatively safe level until Lehman. And when Lehman was allowed to fall apart, then there was a feeling that in the end we still were missing a global central bank. And that's where really the crisis became vicious. Well, I'm saying all of this just to give you a sense of how I think about these issues. Because well, this is a financial phenomenon where finance is everywhere, where the real sector is just a bystander in my story, right? And there are some missing institutions. The lack of institution was very clear in the previous emerging market crisis, was a little less clear now until Lehman. But again, the common factor is that we don't have institutions in place. That's my interpretation. Okay, so you can have a very nice trading system, but you need always, to sustain that, you need finance. You cannot run an economy without finance, without money. And we have not gone all the way, in my interpretation, to having a sustainable global financial system. Okay. Now, let me focus a little bit on the regions. Something that we learned from the previous crisis is that, and especially in Latin America, that has been hit by crisis of this type, from the tequila crisis, like Jerry was mentioning in 1995 and before, is that even though you don't have, or especially when you don't have a global financial system in place, individual countries have to be very, very careful how they run the domestic financial system. For example, we learn in Latin America that it is very dangerous to have a system which is based on foreign currency. We call it liability dollarization. Debts in foreign currency. That's dangerous. We learn that. We learn that it's dangerous in those conditions for a country to have a very large current account deficit. That is to say, for a country to spend much more than it makes. Not only did we learn that by looking at the countries in Latin America, but we did many empirical studies around the world for many, many countries with my co-authors that you can find in the references if you're interested. But the general point is that that comes out very clearly from the empirical analysis. And it's interesting that even though we know